Hi, I'm Bill Waller, Professor of Economics at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and today I want to talk a little bit about why we study political economy. The economics taught in almost all principles of economics courses in colleges and universities across the United States is uh, a combination of microeconomics and macroeconomics derived from the marginalist economics of the late 19th century combined with a form of macroeconomics created in the 1940s as a result of the work of John Maynard Keynes. We call that mainstream economics or the neoclassical synthesis. But all economics points back to Adam Smith in 1776. With the publication of his book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith introduces what's called classical political economy. Classical political economy runs from Adam Smith up to John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. In this period of the classical economists, which are discussed in my other videos, what is clear is that the classical political economy of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus, John Stuart Mill, and many others is a conflict theory of economics. The conflict is basically a conflict over income shares between the people who own the productive means, the capitalists, and labor, the people who work for them. They generate output, which is sold and becomes income, and then that income has to be distributed between those two groups. And it is distributed on the basis of competition between them and competition among them. The capitalists must compete with other capitalists for workers, and the workers must compete with one another to get jobs with the capitalist. How this is resolved is a question of the different theorists, but generally it resolves to some sort of steady state, a static state, where the distribution shares are fixed. There's something called the iron law of wages. It says there's a wage fund, and once that wage fund is used up, there can be no increase in wages or actually increase in the employment of labor. So it's economics of conflict. And this conflict comes to a head with Karl Marx. Karl Marx shows that the system is, in fact, one that is class based, and these class based groups, in this case, what he calls the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but for simplistic terms, we'll call capitalists and laborers, is a class conflict. And that over time, this competition leads to intolerable unemployment and what he calls the immiseration of the proletariat. Wages are always competed down to subsistence because there are more workers than there are capitalists to hire them. This, he argues, will lead to the inevitable collapse of capitalism. Also, all of these classical economists agreed on the labor theory of value or some form of it. And what this means, following John Locke's notion of property, is that it is human labor that creates value for material resources. So Marx argues that since it's the labor component of production that creates all the value, then the capitalist portion must be an expropriation from labor. In addition to this, the low wages leads to alienation and discontent, and eventually these class interests result in some sort of transformation. And this would be studied and is discussed in my video about Marx. Since that time, the neoclassical synthesis has pretty much dominated the mainstream of economics, but all along the way in the history of thought, economists emerged or were created by the system of discussion itself who were in opposition to this mainstream. We've already mentioned Marx, who disagreed with the marginalist utility theory of value. He was a contemporary of John Stuart Mill, who talked about the utility theory of value. And Marx took his economics in a different direction. Similarly, a student of John Bates Clark named Thorstein Veblen disagreed with the way microeconomics by the marginalist was developed. He thought it led to simplistic uh, conceptions of consumption, simplistic conceptions of production. He talked about the relationship between business, enterprise, vested interests, the working person, the common man. In other words, he did not use the categories of land, labor, and capital as meaningful explanations of how production actually occurred. There were other economists who disagreed with the marginalists. We refer to them as the Austrian school. They too did not have an equilibrium notion of economics. They think in terms of the evolution of the economy through competition among capitalists and entrepreneurs. And it is a processual theory of economics based on the superiority of markets transmitting information to others who would guide the process. In addition to these, in 1930s arose the work of John Maynard Keynes, who invented what we call macroeconomics, but it's really better called aggregate economics. Aggregate economics, in John Maynard Keynes' hand, looks at aggregate consumption, aggregate investment, aggregate government spending, and aggregate exports minus imports as driving the income in the economy. It's not so much the individual agents and how they act, but how those consumers, investors, government agencies, importers, and exporters collectively affect the economy. And he argues that he can explain, and does explain, the persistence of unemployment as a result of insufficient effective demand, what we now call aggregate demand. In other words, those groups are not consuming or spending enough to keep us at a level of full employment. Now, these are alternative explanations to the kind of mainstream equilibrium models and arguments used in modern microeconomics and macroeconomics. And each of these alternatives has an insight that is worthy of consideration, serious consideration, about how economics should be done, about what the subject matter of economics really is, what is the purpose, what are the best methods for looking at the economy, how do we interpret the results of the economy, and what is the economy. Because there's another group outside of mainstream economics, and it's even more interesting. It arose in the late 20th century with women economists who were disaffected from all of the approaches of economics because of the neglect of the notion, the cultural notion of gender. All right? Gender being understood as people who are placed in that category, generally feminine, female, and others who choose that identity, and that they perform work in the economy that is undervalued, not recognized, and that they as a group do not attain the kind of income their work deserves, nor are they compensated fairly. This whole range of issues brings them together surrounding the common notion of gender. Now, this drew female economists and feminist economists from all the different schools of thought, and they got together to talk about this and began to meet in the International Association for Feminist Economics. This makes this a very interesting forum to consider because you have economists from all of these schools of thought coming together to grapple with how to include an analysis of gender in economics. This, by its very nature, puts itself outside the mainstream of economics because it is arguing that a cultural category alters the way the economy functions. And this can have very important consequences once you consider this sort of thing. But let's go back to the contribution of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, first of all, suggested that the economy was a conflict economy, that capitalism was a result of the evolution of conflict economies from the past, and in all of these economies, there was a primary mode of production. The primary mode of production in capitalism, the latest stage of this evolution, was that there were people who owned the means of production and everyone else lacking access or ownership of productive resources would have to work for them. Their interests were in conflict. The higher the wages, the lower the income residual for the capitalist. Marx noted that this market system was incredibly efficient, that it was the most productive economy in human history. And he also noticed that it also created poverty of the worst kind, so that by the 1850s in some of the industrial cities in England, human beings achieved the lowest standard of living ever. Let that sink in. He also noticed that this economy was cyclical. It was prone towards expansions and then recessions and then crises, which would cause a reformulation and reorganization of capital after bankruptcies, and this would be reorganized into ever larger firms. In the recovery, those firms would become more productive, there would be employment, but when the next crisis came, the consequences were even more devastating because it would be bigger firms failing and more people losing their jobs. And this is a period of time when if you lost your job in one of these recessions, if you were an older person, you were likely never to be hired again, so that this left a permanent reserve of unemployed workers who were never going to work again. This is a disaffected population that is not going to sit there and quietly fade away. They are going to resist this, as will the workers resist the alienation and exploitation that they're getting in the marketplace and in the workplace for this ever-increasing and competitive capitalism. It is probably the case that Marx was correct, that if this went on long enough and these business cycles got large enough, that the economy as a whole would collapse. So there are lessons to be learned from this. First of all, looking at the economy from the perspective of class, assuming that labor creates all value. Those are questions. That class dynamics are the driving force in economics to the exclusion of all other social practices and social norms and social constructions. That's an interesting thing to consider. And this contrasts with the mainstream economics, which looked at only individual consumer action, individual firm action, and the actions of those who own property. In other words, economic agents were individuals operating in isolation, trying to achieve and maximize their own best interest. Whereas Marx noticed that these people were actually in classes. They worked together in a community-based production facility, and their material interests were similar, or at least in his case the same. The capitalist class had similar class interest and material interests. They were competing with one another. Marx doesn't think capitalists are necessarily bad people, but their actions as capitalists are negative. In other words, this is not about persons in Marx. This is about social classes who are both driven to act in a way that creates these crises by the competition inherent in capitalism. In the mainstream, firms compete with firms, consumers compete with other consumers for goods, sellers compete with one another to sell the goods to consumers. It's all about individuals, and that the individuals acting creates the economy. It's a very different notion. It is also one that includes a concept of equilibrium, that supply will equal demand is its most fundamental expression, and that means all consumers maximizing their utility subject to their income constraint creates demand for goods, and firms maximizing output at the lowest cost to maximize profits is their only motivation. When firms are competing with one another and when consumers are competing with other, the market mechanism coordinates that supply and demand by setting a price where all consumers who are willing to pay the equilibrium price will receive the good, and all sellers who will sell for the equilibrium price will make those sales to consumers. This equilibrium is considered stable if not disturbed by outside forces, and it is ultimately the measure of social value of those particular commodities, whatever their price is. So, this equilibrating mechanism always brings us back to a circumstance where we find stability. This is a stability of firms, workers, consumers all together in an economy. There's even a notion of general equilibrium where all markets can be in equilibrium simultaneously under certain pretty unrealistic conditions. So you can see that there's two different things going on here. There's a class analysis, a conflict analysis, a focus on value as labor, versus a highly individualistic notion of competition in modern mainstream economics, what we call microeconomics, where it is only individual action and their primary motivation of maximizing their own well being, which creates a stable economy that is only affected by external forces, what we call exogenous forces, and should not be interfered with by government or any one other agency that would upset that equilibrium or try and change it for its own purposes. So you get a very laissez-faire view, which is consistent with Adam Smith in the mainstream of economics. Marx leads to the conclusion that laissez-faire leads to crisis, and that there could be real problems. Marx's theory is based on a theory of history called dialectical materialism. He believes that material forces, material conditions drive the economy, and the dialectic is the conflict between the two groups in society that lead to both the competition and the ultimate instability of the system. The mainstream obviously remained the dominant stream of economics in particularly Europe, England, and the United States. But there was always a conversation going on among these alternative economists. Another economist, maybe 30 years later, a student of John Bates Clark, an important marginalist economist who came up with the marginalist theory of production, looked at these things from a different way. Now, he had a different background than most economists. Well, he studied economics, he also studied philosophy, but he also studied anthropology. And in the 1870s to 1890s, while classical political economy was recognized as a discipline, the rest of the social sciences more or less fell under the category of moral philosophy. But they began to emerge as distinct social sciences, and one of the most important was anthropology. Anthropology has as its fundamental perspective the exploration of culture. Okay, this is similar to sociology, and in many places the two are linked together. But the important thing here is the emergence of the concept of culture. And that is the notion that human beings create a vision of the world, an organizational understanding of the world, and this is a shared understanding in their community, and that the beliefs and activities and methods of doing things in that community create a perspective on the world that they all hold. Also, Veblen was affected by pragmatic philosophy, which he studied under a philosopher named Charles Peirce. And it's called pragmatism. Pragmatism is not what we ordinarily talk about in terms of pragmatism. It basically means that there is an ongoing problem solving process to which human beings apply their intelligence to problems and to try and solve them. And that this is an ongoing process, and it's a critical process because what it does is search to eliminate error and to find new information that supports a particular approach to that problem. So think of it as a problem solving process, and that what enhances human communities' lives is solving their problems. Basically, a society that solves its problems can persist, a society that doesn't fails. When you put these two together into a theory of economics, what you get is a cultural view of the issues of consumption and how firms are organized. There are social norms that drive consumption, not just maximizing your utility. There are social norms that drive firm behavior that, like Marx, there is a notion of groups, but this group is a cultural group, and it is not divided along class lines necessarily. It can be organized in the way the many cultures in our society have been organized, and the people in that culture are born into it. They inherit that cultural view, but every human being has a kind of different map of the culture, which means there's variation here. And that leads us to the other thing that Veblen incorporated. He did not like the static equilibrium framework. He just simply didn't see it in the real world. And frankly, if you look today, it's hard to see equilibrium. We live in a world characterized by change. And so he looked at this cultural economics from an evolutionary perspective. He was greatly influenced by Darwin, and in particular, Darwin's natural selection. So he thought economics should become an evolutionary science. It's a science of evolutionary processes, not static equilibriums. So that sets him apart. Secondly, his notion of the human being is that the human being contains every element of the culture to some degree, but it varies. Now, when we look at our societies, we don't see just individuals running around unless we are conditioned to do so. What we see is that we participate in organized human activity. We are in families. We are born into one, usually. Or if we aren't, we're placed in an institution for caring for children. As we grow up in our family, we have, encounter our relatives, our family, our neighbors, and they become people who we interact with in a community sort of organization. But then there are more formal structures which intervene. We go to school. Schools are highly organized systems of activity. They are not generally done for profit in the United States. We have public schools, though they're just supplemented by private schools. So he began to notice that our activities were clustered not in individuals, but in these social organizations, which he called institutions. And indeed, he argued that these institutions gave structure and stability to society. And that the purpose of all of this economic activity and all of this cultural activity was to ensure that the people in the community had access to the resources necessary to live. He called it the science of social provisioning. This is in contrast to the mainstream notion that economics is about the allocation of resources to their most efficient uses. In the case of individuals, maximizing their utility. In the case of firms, maximizing their production in an efficient way is to create profits. So one is focused on this sort of individual pursuit of utility and profits, and the other is on a community system of social provisioning. What is the goal of that social provisioning? And what is the goal of that community? Well, for the human beings in it to flourish, and to flourish in all their amazing differences, because communities are not all made up of identical individuals pursuing the same objectives. So, with this notion of culture and this notion of evolution, Veblen looks at consumption during his period of life, which was called the Gilded Age in the United States. This is the age coincident with the rise of industrialization in the United States. And when he looks at consumption, he notices that consumption seems to be driven by people consuming the appropriate amount for their social status in the society they live in. In other words, they have a peer group who they look to for signals about what constitutes the appropriate consumption for people in that group. And they want to keep up with the consumption norms of that group. Those groups are differentiated by their income, all right, by the amount of money they have. So there are low-income individuals, and the individuals in those communities have standards of consumption, what is proper consumption, appropriate consumption, and they try and meet those. Similarly, there are, middle income families that have an idea that they are in that middle and they seek to consume the way their neighbors and their communities do. All of this is because this level of consumption is appropriate. It is what is expected. It is what identifies you as a member of that group. And then he sees our society as a whole bunch of levels of different amounts of income and wealth, which define those groups. An upper class, a middle class, a lower class, or we could even divide it into quintiles, or we can divide it into particular kinds of jobs, and look at how those things define what people consume. I often tease my students a bit about the fact that they are wearing the undergraduate student uniform to class, which is generally comfortable clothes, comfortable shoes, their appearance. Many of the men have longer hair, many of the women do as well. And I point out to them that if they go into corporate America, their clothing is going to change. All right. And their haircut's going to change. Most of them will look closer to me than they do to themselves right now. And the men in particular will wear suits. And suits come in two colors, blue and gray. Shirts come in two colors, white and white. They will wear either Cordovan wingtips or black Oxfords. They can buy a pair and wear them for the rest of their lives if they take care of it. And if a moth won't eat it, they won't wear it. The one area where they can express their individuality will be the tie wrapped around their neck. They all think this is absurd. They would never do this, and they all ultimately end up doing it. And many women in the corporate world find themselves forced into poor imitations of the male uniform. They will ultimately end up joining the same health clubs, living in the same size of apartments, driving the same cars, going to the same cocktail bars as their peers. And in fact, they want to fit in and succeed at their job because that is what will get them promoted. That means conformity with these norms established by your income level structure behavior within those various levels. Okay? So he points out that much of our consumption needs to be conspicuous because it identifies us. Similarly, we participate in the leisure activities appropriate. Calls that conspicuous leisure, and the motivation is not the maximization of utility, but pecuniary emulation, the drive to consume in the appropriate manner for the social group with which you identify. This leads to very different kinds of consumptions and very different patterns of consumptions, and it provides a much stronger explanation for consumerism in our culture in particular. Similarly, he argues that firms in and of themselves have evolved as an institution from something like the competitive firms identified in mainstream economics. But over time, as they grow, they get large and they develop into different kinds of business enterprises that are much more complex with a production part of the firm that is overseen and governed by technical means and industrial engineering, and the business side of the firm, which is driven by the business side, which is focused on profits. And that as firms get larger, as in the mainstream theory of monopoly, they have more flexibility in pricing. And as a result of that, the firm's business section begins to focus on profit, and the industrial section is focusing on production. But that monopoly aspect means profits can be increased by restricting output, so that the business portion of the enterprise will get the production part of the enterprise to underproduce. In other words, the firm will literally sabotage its own production. This is the cultural necessity of the firm, but it conflicts with the ability of the society as a whole, the culture as a whole, to provision itself, because it's restricting output that would be output available to the society as a whole if it were not restricted. So it is sort of a transfer of resources, both financial and real, from the community to the business enterprise in the form of profits, and that their interest now is in conflict. It is vested in the profit making aspect of society, the financial side of society, whereas the common person is really worried about provisioning in the sense of providing for themselves, their family, and the stability of their community. So, again, notice there's a conflict element in Veblen. Its evolutionary push that the evolution of society is the evolution of the institutions we use for provisioning has no notion of equilibrium. It does not ensure efficiency. It may make things better, it may make things worse. And Veblen was a pessimist. He really thought that the triumph of imbecile institutions would cause people to do things that were detrimental to the flourishing of their society, possibly to the point of collapse. He argued that policy was possible to avoid these things, but our tendency, because of institutional inertia, was just to let things drift. Culture is strong. People have internalized it, and the belief structure that goes with it, they are very stubborn about changing. So you end up with a very slow but economics. And Keynes' view was frowned upon by more conservative economists who preferred to not be engaged in regulating the economy. They thought the economy was self-correcting, and they rejected this Keynesian framework. Others tried to incorporate it into this, and they turned it into a technical model of the goods market, the money market, and the bond market, and argued that monetary and fiscal policy could regulate the economy to achieve an equilibrium between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, while achieving equilibrium in all three of those markets. The fourth market, the labor market, didn't have to be included, because if you took care of the goods market, the money market, and the bonds market, that in fact would put the labor market into equilibrium. So the best thing to do was to regulate the economy, and the way they preferred to do it was through monetary policy, because that's indirect and it doesn't interfere in the equilibrating of the other markets in their view. They were called monetarist. They eventually were a key component that evolved into our modern neoliberal ideology, which now is the dominant form of economics in the United States and large portions of the world. So, why do we study political economy? This brings us to a better understanding of how, when we are trained in the mainstream, there are things that we have eliminated from the analysis that we might want to think about. It doesn't mean we have to become a Marxist or a Veblennian or a Keynesian or a post Keynesian who remain more true to Keynes's original argument than the mainstream incorporation of it, or even become monetarists or Austrians of a more conservative right. But no group of economists has a monopoly on understanding of how economies work. They're way too complex. All of us are looking at some aspect of it and neglecting others, especially when we try to formalize our theories into mathematical models, which by their very nature leave a great deal out and are only solvable when we make assumptions to constrain the possibilities of the real world. So they leave a lot out and leave a lot to be desired as a way of thinking about it. Narrative analysis, in my view, is often the best way, because narrative analysis gives you something to listen to, like today, and to argue with and to think about. And it is through our conversations as economists, open-minded conversations, open to alternative approaches, that we become better informed, and, if I might be a little bit conceited, wiser about how the economy works, or at least not so certain that our way is the right way. Economics cannot be a quest for certainty, it needs to be a quest for understanding. And as the economy changes, economics has to change with it and acknowledge those changes and bring it into its theorizing.